There are a lot of sayings you come to know as a fan of this sport. MMA math doesn't work. Styles make fights. It's the punch you don't see coming. Head movement. Head movement! And of course, ring rust is real, quote unquote. Essentially meaning the longer layoff you have from the sport, the worse you'll perform in a return. You know what I have to say about this? Bullshit.
Watch your profanity.
I'm Jason from MMA On Point, and these are 10 times ring rust was disproven in MMA. Number 10, O'Malley versus QUINONEZ. 2 years. Few fighters really have had the jump off that O'Malley has had in popularity right out of the gate like he has. By O'Malley's second fight with Andre Soccer Mom, he was already doing Meme Rogan interviews in the cage, and the crowd ate it up. But Sean ran into some pretty notable brick walls at this time, and it came in the form of one word: Osterine, which essentially is not a steroid but has very similar effects in terms of building muscle for athletes. And he tested positive for it twice throughout the end of 2018 and then 2019. One resulted in a first cancellation versus Chito Vera, which is pretty interesting. Either way, this left him out of the sport for a full 2 years. And while Jose QUINONEZ isn't exactly the biggest name, it's pretty noteworthy that he was a 5-year UFC veteran at this point with only a single loss in 6 fights. But despite the long layoff, O'Malley insisted that he was just getting a ton better and honing his craft during the time off. To be fair, when you watch this fight back, I think he was right. He pretty much obliterated Jose in the first round, and after comfortably picking him apart on the outside for 2 minutes, Sean landed a big head kick, even though it was partially blocked, and finished him with some quick ground and pounds. 2 years off? No sweat. Number 9, Khabib versus HORCHER. 2 years. This one is a bit infamous for a few reasons. Number 1, it's potentially the greatest of all time, certainly at lightweight, with an undefeated record of already 22-0 at this point, who already had beaten RDA at the time, who himself became champion in his absence, and well, he was against HORCHER. Of course, this was a late replacement for Ferguson, relentlessly proving how cursed this fight was, which also meant HORCHER had to step in on 9 days' notice. But by all means, he was a fighter that deserved a shot in the UFC as the Cage Fury champion, which is a top feeder league, by the way, to the UFC, including stars like Paul Felder, Jim Miller, Aljo, and more recent guys like Dustin Jacoby and Sean Brady in their ranks. So it's a pretty damn good place to come from at 12-1. He even fought in Bellator as well. But Khabib for your first fight? Damn. But still, Nurmagomedov just so happened to be coming off a 2-year layoff thanks to multiple injuries. It's also worth noting that his father had to talk Khabib out of retirement during this time as well. So it's a pretty significant moment. Everyone now knowing Khabib retired at 29-0 in 2020, there are no spoilers here. Khabib easily dispatched the UFC rookie in the second round following his trademark ground and pounds. But still, it was like the guy never left the sport for even a day. Number 8, Lesnar versus Hunt. 4.5 years. I don't think I could find you a more controversial comeback to the UFC if I tried. I would probably rank it higher if the obvious use of substances weren't involved, just because it's so long. But Lesnar would make his surprise return against initially the dreaded TBA before it was announced that Mark Hunt would fill in that slot. And while I'm not going to call it the most exciting fight, it was most likely the least entertaining bout he'd ever been in. But it shows a level of respect for Mark Hunt as well. He was, after all, ranked number 8 at the time, so it's a pretty stout test for a guy who hadn't fought in about 4.5 years. And it was really dominant for Lesnar too. He just wrestled him the whole time. But it definitely proved ring rust was not a factor for him. He even stated at the post-fight presser that he would likely come back. But of course, that's when his USADA test started coming back for hydrochlomethine, or clomiphene for short, which is basically something that can help mask the side effects of anabolic steroids and boost testosterone. Popping for one test before the fight and another after, so there's that. It's definitely the biggest reason we have not seen him back. And then Mark Hunt began a lawsuit with the UFC. Fun times. Number 7, Chad Mendes versus Miles Jury, 2.5 years. You guys remember Miles Jury, right? He's got wins over guys like Michael Johnson, Diego Sanchez, and Takanori Gomi. Well, if not, it's a pretty great example of how underrated his career has perhaps become. At one point, he was even 15-0 with 6 straight wins, including all of those names I just mentioned. But then he ran ran into an angry leg-kicking Donald Cerrone before moving down to 145, only to find Charles Oliveira waiting for him with a guillotine. No shame in those losses though, so he moved through a couple more wins in this lighter division. Then out of nowhere, Chad Mendes shows up. By now we are talking a 2018 version, and Mendes has disappeared from the sport since the KO loss to Edgar in 2015, and then a growth hormone suspension for 2 years. Whoops. But still, we are coming back from 3 years off at this time with Miles Jury, and he was still a pretty high prospect at this point. Oh shit, look at that height difference. Anyway, only took half a round for Mendes to unload a massive left hand on him and get a big stoppage. I mean, this looked like the guy who was KOing Ricardo Lamas back in the day. He looked absolutely stellar that night. Unfortunately for Mendes though, he'd run into an up-and-coming juggernaut in Volkanovski next and retire from the sport. What a legend though. Number 6, Uriah Faber versus Ricky Simón, 2.5 years. From one Team Alpha Male member to the coach seems to make a bit of sense, doesn't it? And this one follows a very similar path. But about a year later, oddly, it was December of 2016 instead of 2015 like it was for Mendes, and Uriah Faber came back December of 2019, not 2018, at the age of 40. No USADA sanctions for him though. One thing that is notable is that in 2017, Faber was actually inducted into the Hall of Fame, putting him in a pretty small class of UFC fighters that competed after their induction. Guys like Randy Couture or Mark Coleman come to mind. So symbolically, this couldn't be any more of a prime example of where ring rust should be applied. Not to mention, Ricky Simón has looked absolutely incredible in his career with a 5-fight win streak as the writing of this video, knocking off former title challengers like Ray Borg, Asuncao, and recently picking off undefeated prospect Jack Shore. And Faber pretty much just went right through this guy when they clashed. Even though Simón was crazy aggressive to promptly test any rust Faber might have had, but then Faber just hit him once with a big right hand and closed the show. It's hard to find a more triumphant return for a legend. In his home city, no less. In another parallel to Mendes, Faber would lose his next fight to another top prospect by the name of Petr Yan, and he has not returned since. Number 5, the Korean Zombie versus Dennis Bermudez, 3.5 years. So most of the guys on this list were forced out of the sport in one way or another due to injury or PED violations, but this one is much different. Obligatory military service. And it couldn't have come at a worse time. Jung had just challenged the then invincible Jose Aldo during his title reign and unfortunately suffered a freak injury to his shoulder on a missed punch that left him screaming in agony. And being in that title picture when the division was still starving for stars while also being one of the few standouts back then, the timing was unfortunate. But what was happening in South Korea is something called conscription, and basically means any able-bodied person must be a soldier for a minimum of 2 years. So that's exactly what happened after he suffered an injury before a fight with Akira Kurosawa in October of 2014. So when he would return in February 2017, we're talking 3.5 years out of the sport at this point. Reebok had changed the way fighters had looked, USADA was implemented, the Fertittas didn't even own the organization anymore. It was just a completely different looking company by then, and longtime fans will no doubt know Dennis Bermudez, considering he's fought just about everyone under the sun in his 8-year tenure with the UFC. Guys like Max Holloway, Darren Elkins, and Jeremy Stevens. And he was on a 2-fight win streak at this point as well. But the Korean Zombie was on fire this night. Bermudez struggled to land much of anything, with his takedowns also stuffed, and then a monstrous right uppercut shut his lights out halfway through the first round. Number 4, Ortega versus the Korean Zombie, 2 years. Uh-oh, back-to-back zombies, watch out. When Ortega uppercutted Frankie Edgar to the moon in 2018, it was almost like the hype train was right behind him. They built train tracks to the moon? I don't know, this analogy's falling apart. But at the time, Ortega looked to be one of the next big stars for the organization. And sure enough, he'd get a chance at elevating himself by going after Max Holloway next for his featherweight crown by the end of the year. Unfortunately for Ortega, title shots haven't exactly gone his way in the UFC. And this one was so bad that the doctor just couldn't allow him to continue to the final round. It was a rough night for somebody this good. But then we just didn't hear from him at all. For almost 2 years, in fact, and the time he was gone, the whole title picture would drastically change. Every male division had their belts change hands outside of Khabib, who would retire only a few days later. But this set of divisional title changes also included his own, with Volkanovski taking the throne from Max. Tells you how much things changed in only a couple years. And with an always tough Korean zombie there waiting in October of 2020, fresh off of beating guys like Edgar and Moicano, it was a real test of that ring rust. But what went down was perhaps Ortega's best performance in his entire career. Just a thorough dismantling of Jung for 25 minutes. 50-45 showing he didn't lose even a single round. And it all proved that the time off may have actually been better for him. Perhaps bald Ortega is a thing. Number 3, Nate Diaz versus Anthony Pettis. 3 years. There's almost a certain poetic justice to this one because of the history behind it. Way back in 2013, extending to 2015, Pettis was at the absolute height of his game and on top of the MMA world. People genuinely thought he might be one of the pound-for-pound best in the making. Meanwhile, Dana was publicly dishing out rants saying Nate Diaz was
not a needle mover. His brother is a needle mover. He's not.
The truth is, it wasn't a great time for him. These were pre-McGregor explosions / upset days, and Nate had just lost his only title bid to this day. Then he got stopped for the first time by Josh Thompson after an insane amount of punishment. He still didn't go out cold, of course, because it's Nate Diaz. But if you fast forward a bit, the Diaz-McGregor saga happens, Pettis shockingly loses his belt to RDA and goes on a skid, and before we know it, Nate is nowhere to be seen. The Conor rematch happened in 2016, and here we are in 2019 with no fight news. That is, until we finally get word that his return will be against the former champ Pettis, somebody nobody thought he could beat when he was a champ. And it ended up being on a pretty insanely stacked card too. There are a bunch of reasons he took all this time off, but one thing for sure is that Diaz was returning on his own terms. Diaz absolutely took it to Pettis the entire fight, controlling him on the ground and feet to a decision. Clearly the time off was not a problem here, and then finally we got the admission from Dana White afterwards.
He's a needle mover now.
Number 2, Dominic Cruz versus TJ Dillashaw. 3 years, twice? Alright. Full disclosure here, bias admitted, this has got to be my favorite one on the list, but it should be prefaced that TJ was indeed not his first major example of ring rust being called into question. As the champion who never lost his belt to close out 2011, Cruz would soon embark on a slew of debilitating injuries, delaying his return for many, many years. Over the next 3 years, he would go through 2 ACL surgeries, one being a tear and the other being a rejected replacement for the old ACL, so he'd have to get a third ACL. This is all just to replace that initial one, and miraculously, he made it back. But by this time, the title wasn't part of the picture for him anymore because 2 champions had already replaced him. Even still, his opponent Takaya Mizugaki was a top 5 ranked opponent, so he was definitely still in the running for a title if he could put a win together. And what resulted might actually be his most dominant win in the entirety of his career. After making a few quick reads on the feet, Cruz just took advantage and went straight for the kill. It was about as triumphant a return as you could ask for with a guaranteed title shot ready for him. But then, believe it or not, Cruz then tore the ACL in his other knee, which is just fucking crazy. And he'd end up waiting for another 3 years to get a chance at the title he wanted back. It would end up being one of the closest fights in UFC title history against TJ Dillashaw, who was holding the belt. Of course, I've admitted my bias already, so scoring it for Cruz can be questioned, but it's a decision heavily debated to this day. No matter what side you take, they certainly proved that ring rust was far from a problem. Number 1, GSP versus BISPING. 4 years. Man, there is just so much to unpack here. 4 years is a big enough reason to qualify this one at the top of our list, but the circumstances behind it by far meant it had to be number 1. GSP being the champion who hadn't lost his belt and walked away for largely PED concerns inside the sport and a desire to move things over to a WADA system certainly helped to explain why he was away for so long, but it also lends itself to why this return was in fact so great. Like Cruz coming back after never losing the belt, it meant people expected a championship level performance. And with him being at the top of the GOAT list, it's hard not to see why. The only problem was GSP didn't quite look right. And a lot of the early pre-fight training footage and pictures, it looked like perhaps he was not in fighting shape. And while most brushed it off, many were skeptical. But it turned out he was dealing with something far more serious, one of the biggest contributors to why he isn't competing anymore. Through the process of bulking up to 185, his body rejected the process and essentially caused him to develop a condition called ulcerative colitis. Basically, it causes massive inflammation along the digestive tract and can even be life-threatening in some cases. Up until a couple of weeks before the fight, the whole thing was in question if he can even make it to the fight. And despite a struggle in the early going, he would find the rear naked choke. marking the first time St. Pierre had finished an opponent since all the way back in 2009 against BJ Penn. So in the face of all this adversity, with a much bigger opponent who gave him his stiffest guard game, a disease on top of that, the layoff, and all of the pressure, he showed what DC rightly said looked to be an even better version of himself. I want to give a big thanks to one of the OGs of this channel, Max Randall. I love this man despite the fact that he didn't invite me to Bali. I was supposed to get engaged. You can follow him on Twitter at Max_Randall. And then the music, my guy Ben Rosette for putting together the tune in the intro of this vid. So damn good. You can find his music in the description. All right, and that leaves you guys. I appreciate you guys for watching today. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And then I guess my question for you guys is, do you think ring rust is real? It's one of these things that people always talk about, but I think these ones pretty much definitively prove it wrong. If you're in shape, you'll be good to go. But anyhow, let me know what you guys think in the comments, and we'll talk soon. Peace.